Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Molly Shoichet, and I am super excited to welcome you to today's talk, which is Breaking the Myth of Objectivity. This is brought to you by the Healthy Inclusive Labs Committee of Medicine by Design. And what we're trying to do through the Healthy and Inclusive Labs Committee is bring you different ways of thinking and expand our knowledge base, and then figure out how we can, change things and make the world really a better place for all of us. So we are creating opportunities to engage in conversations about, obviously, equity, diversity, inclusion, in innovation systemic racism, unconscious bias, barriers to inclusion, and really everything that's encompassed within that. So we are trying to change society, and we're so excited that you're participating in today's presentation. We live in a multicultural society, and this idea of inclusiveness is core to everything that we want to do. And in that spirit, I want to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So today, we have two amazing speakers for you: Heather Krause, who is the CEO of All Count and Datassist, Inc., and Azadeh Yadollahi, a senior scientist at the Toronto Rehab Institute at the University Health Network, and the Thematic program Inequity co-lead at the Data Sciences Institute. In today's event, we will discuss the role of bias in quantitative data, which I think is so fascinating. We all think of data as being unbiased. So it's fascinating to think that data may actually be biased. And of course, we want to think about why all good science should be equitable, along with the practical and concrete tools to identify and account for biases in quantitative data. So what we're going to have today is we'll have two speakers. First, we'll have Heather Krause speaking, and then we'll have Azadeh. I should have practiced your name, Azadeh. I'm so sorry. But we'll have Azadeh Yadollahi presenting. So let me encourage you to ask questions. Science is all about asking questions. So you can ask them in the chat at any time or in the Q&A at any time. But also, we'll be having a panel discussion after Azadeh's presentation. And so I encourage you to participate live then. Let me first start by introducing Heather Krause. Heather is a statistician with decades of global experience working on complex data problems and producing real-world knowledge. She's a cross-sector thought leader in data equity issues and works on government, social sector, education, and corporate data projects. Her first company, Datassist, Inc., works globally with national governments, transnational corporations, and the largest players in the NGO space. Heather is a co-founder of We All Count, a project for equity in data, working with teams across the globe to embed a lens of ethics into their data products, from funding to data collection to statistical analysis and algorithmic accountability. Her unique set of tools and contributions have been sought across a range of clients, from MasterCard and Volkswagen to the United Nations, the Syrian Refugee Resettlement Secretariat, Airbnb, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and of course now us, Medicine by Design. She is also on the Data Advisory Board of the UNHCR. As the co-founder of two successful data science companies, she attacks the largest questions facing societies today, working with both civic and corporate organizations to improve outcomes and their lives. So Heather, we are so grateful for you to fit us into your busy schedule, and I welcome you now to share your slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. it's always funny after you get to the actual event and somebody reads that out loud. But thank you for having me, and I'm so excited that despite the turbulence on so many levels in our world, such a large number of you are here to talk together about really what I consider to be one of the worst equity problems that is facing us in the data science sector, whether you are a producer of quantitative evidence or a consumer of quantitative evidence. People are making prejudiced choices without being aware that they're making prejudiced choices. And of course, quantitative data, as Molly was saying at the opening, is thought of to be kind of a silver bullet that can cut through bias, human error, injustice. It really is the thing that we can use to understand what's going on in a value neutral way. And we want that. We want our evidence to be as truthful and useful as possible. And so we have some good news and some bad news to talk about today. And I came bounding joyfully out of my postgraduate work in mathematical statistics and data science, ready to kind of hit the ground and use my newfound skills in a way to understand what was going on in the world, because I firmly believe after many years of education that data is objective and that quantitative evidence is value neutral. And it didn't take me very long of working on the ground to realize that, in fact, data is not objective and the evidence generation process is not value neutral. And the place that taught me this first and foremost was my first job out of my postgraduate work, which was in rural Bangladesh. And I was doing agricultural research in rural Bangladesh. And agricultural research is not one that you might think of as having, a lot of diversity and inclusion issues in terms of the mathematics. But when you're doing it in rural Bangladesh, it becomes very clear to you that, in fact, even what we think of as data, what I was taught as a grad student was kind of messy data, bore very little relationship to the data that was being collected on the ground, which was mostly being collected in images and stickers, and taking a huge amount of the time that these women farmers in rural Bangladesh had to actually track the productivity and the agriculture inputs that they were using and how it all was related. And it was this experience that just really opened my eyes to how value laden anything quantitative is, right down to the simplest mathematical formula that we might think of. Let's pretend that we have a school and that this school has 3 classrooms. Classroom A has 3 students, Classroom B has 6 students, and Classroom C has 9 students. And we want to know, what is the average classroom size? What's the average number of students across these 3 classrooms? If you say that the average classroom size in this school is 6 students, you are correct. And if you say that the average number of students in a classroom in this school is 7, you are also correct. There are at least 2 robust ways to get an answer to this question, depending on whose lived experience you center in the way that you answer the question. So let's say that we want to know what the average classroom size is in this school from the perspective of the teachers. We go into classroom A, we go to the teacher and we say, how many students are in your classroom? That teacher says, there's 3 students in my classroom. Then we go to classroom B, we go to that teacher. How many students are in your classroom? 6 students in my classroom. Teacher in classroom C, there are 9 students in my classroom. We do what probably most of you did, the mental math. We add up the 3, the 6, and the 9, and we get 18. Then we divide by the number of perspectives, and we get, from the teacher's perspective, the average classroom size is 6. No problem there. However, what if we're doing educational research on a new pedagogy, and part of the implementation of that pedagogy has to do with the interrelation between classroom size, the new pedagogy, and how well the students learn to do something? We then actually need to know the experience of the students, not the experience of the teachers, because that's not what we're trying to study. We're trying in this case to center the lived experiences of students. So go to classroom A, we ask the first student, how many students are in your classroom? That student looks around and tells you their experience. There are 3 students in my classroom. Second student, we say, how many students are in your classroom? What is your experience? That student looks around and says, there are 3 students in my classroom. Third student looks around, says, there are 3 students in my classroom. Then we go to classroom B and we do the same thing. We go to the first student and we say, what is your experience? How many students are in your classroom? That student looks around and correctly says 6. Second student looks around, correctly says, there are 6 students in my classroom. All the rest of the students in classroom B say there are 6. Then we do the same thing in classroom C. All the students correctly say, in their experience, they were in a classroom with 9 students. We then do the mathematics in the exact same way. We add up all of these responses. We get 126. We divide by the number of perspectives and we get 7. So I am not saying that the answer 7 is more equitable than the answer 6. What I am saying is, to a very basic mathematical question, what's the average classroom size in this school? There are at least 2 correct answers, depending on whose lived experience you are centering. And 6 and 7 are very close together. And that's because I used a very small school as an example, so we could do this math together quickly. But of course, if we were talking about a much larger school or school district, the numbers get much farther apart. And some of you, because I know there's some mathematicians among us today and scientists, are saying, Heather, you're talking about the difference between a simple average and a weighted average. And I won't dispute you there, but the question I would ask is, all averages are weighted averages. The difference is the one that we assume to be a simple average is the calculation that centers the assumed position of power or the dominant worldview. We really like to think that data science or evidence creation has a choice, a big important choice, which is, what question are we going to ask? Just like Molly was saying, science is about asking questions, 100%. And then we get some objective data, we do some objective analysis, we get some objective results, and we make an objective decision, or we have some objective evidence. That's kind of the theory of objectivity. Although, if you've ever been involved in creating a piece of research using quantitative data, you will have direct experience that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of choices that get made in every single step of the way. And it's these choices that prioritize whose opinions, whose worldview, whose values get embedded in the data, in the research generation process. So these choices that get made along the way are actually the levers of power. And as soon as we realize that these choices are the choices that get to determine whose lived experience gets centered in the data, whose lived experience gets centered in what denominator we use, whose lived experience gets centered in where funding goes, we realize that each of these choices are the places where we get to align our work with our equity goals or not. And the immediate question then is, well, what is the right choice? Can you give me a recipe so I can do this equitably? And the answer is no, I cannot, because it is a process. It is not a binary state. And the equity goals for every piece of research is going to be different. So there isn't like a stamp of equity. People come to me like they're looking for the holy grail, like, can you please certify my work as equitable? And I say, I'm sorry, I can't, because there's no such thing. And to help kind of calm people and to help kind of reduce overwhelm when we're talking about breaking through the myth of objectivity, we have a toolkit. My organization is called All Count, a project for equity and data. And we have a toolkit that we call the data equity framework. And I don't think that the data equity framework of these tools is the only path towards equitable work. It's just a useful set of tools that we've been working with and testing for the past many years now that help you understand where you are in the process of evidence generation, whether you're at the funding stage or the motivation stage or the project design stage, the data collection stage, the analysis, interpretation, or communication stage, help you understand and get oriented to where you are in your process, and then help you understand what choices you are making at each one of those steps. And then help you align those choices with your equity goals or the equity goals of your project. So what I'm going to do today is just talk to you a little bit about some of the highlights of the works that we do with different steps. And then I'll, of course, give you the opportunity to dig in deeper on your own time if you're interested. But the important thing to remember is that although I talk about 7 steps in the data equity framework, these 7 steps are not silos, and the whole process of evidence generation is intersectional, like everything with equity, and that the changes that anyone on your team or in your organization make will have ripple effects on the other parts, the other 7 steps. So I'm going to first talk to you just really briefly about the tools and what we think about at the funding stage, because often people think, well, it's whether or not the data is biased or whether or not the algorithm is fair. And those are very important things, and that's really true. But the funding step, the resource allocation step, is critical to setting you on a path where you can even begin to align your research with your equity goals. And in terms of the funding step, the 3 big things to think about are the interplay of data, money, and influence. These are really the big 3 vectors of power in the data science process. Not the only, of course, but the big 3. And when you find yourself at the funding stage, whether you are a funder, whether you receive funding, whether you're both, it's important to consider things like who is setting the value of the data that I'm working with, and who is setting the prices of the data that I'm working with. Data is a commodity. It is a resource, and it is essential if you're going to align your work with an equity, with an equity perspective and with your equity goals, that even at the very start of your project, you spend some time assessing the current state of what is the interplay of data, money, and decision-making in this project. Are you a person that is partnering with people who are sharing their data with you and accruing value because they're sharing data with you? Are you someone who is harvesting data and just making the most of it? Are you somebody that is actually purchasing, providing direct, palpable value to the people whose data you are working with? And again, I'm not saying that one of these is the correct relationship. What I'm saying is it's very important anytime you're working with data that you take a minute and assess the current state of what are the flows of money, decision-making, and data through the project that you're working on, and do those flows align with the work that you're trying to do and the equity goals. Okay, the next step I'm going to talk about in our time together today is project design. And project design is one of my favorites. I'm a practitioner. When I'm not talking, I am much happier kind of working on the ground, collecting data, generating research from the lived experiences of people. And so project design is where we're talking about the why. Why are we doing this project? How is this project funded? Into how. How are we actually going to do this? In terms of data equity, this is a very critical stage because the operationalization of the concepts and the goals of your project always involve making choices. And those choices always prioritize lived experiences. And the number one thing that we recommend in the project design phase is to brainstorm, to spend at least 5 minutes. If you have a whole afternoon, that would be amazing. Thinking outside the box. How would you design this project differently if you weren't constrained by the academic credentials that you have to comply with, or the funding demands of who is ever funding your project, or even the personal habits, the conveniences of you and your team. And we have many, many examples I can share with you, but this one I really like because this one is Canadian. And we had a group of researchers realize that the work that they were doing had an equity goal of centering the experiences of First Nations peoples. And that when they were collecting data, they were doing stratified survey sampling in this particular case about health equity. And they were stratifying the way that they collected that data along kind of, conventional Canadian geographies. But a map exists, a very cool map made by an organization called nativeland.ca that you can download. It's a digital API of the geographic boundaries that are meaningful to First Nations people. And that if we collected data that was geographically stratified along those lines, it would actually be much more aligned with the goals of this particular research project. And that data, just by the process of the way it was collected, would already have a different worldview embedded in it, a worldview that was much more aligned with the goals of this project. To help you do those brainstorms, I highly encourage you, if you're having trouble figuring out how to brainstorm, to check out a tool that we have on our website, very concrete, very non-technical, called the Perspective Microscope. It's a brainstorming tool that we have used from homelessness, people, fifth graders experiencing homelessness in Texas, to heads of state at the United Nations. It's essentially a brainstorming tool that allows you to take turns considering whose point of view is getting prioritized when you start framing the questions in your research or your evidence generation. And then if a certain community's perspective was prioritized and they looked through that lens, what data source would they want? And what questions would they ask of the data source? Again, this is a brainstorming activity to help you get outside of your box, essentially. Okay, the last one I'm going to talk about in the time we have today is analysis. And because analysis is really, if I had to choose one of the 7 steps, I would choose analysis because, of course, I'm a statistician. So I love to build models and see what I can get the data to say. Oh, I am wrong. Sorry, it's Friday. I am actually going to talk to you about data collection before I talk to you about analysis. Data, because that makes sense, because before you do analysis, you need to get some data. And social identity data is often thought of as a very important part of embedding equity in our work, and it is. However, used naively, social identity data can actually double down on stereotypes, racism, colonialism, homophobia, and the rest. If you're going to use social identity data, at minimum, you need to be able to answer 4 questions about that social identity data. And that's true if you're collecting your own data. That's true if you're using somebody else's data. That's true if you are just making a decision based on somebody else's evidence. So if you show me a statement that says 25% of our patients are Black, I can't make heads nor tails of that. That is not a sentence that is meaningful to me because it doesn't have nearly enough context. First thing I need to know is who made that selection. The first thing I need included in that sentence is how did that person come to be labeled as Black? Did they self-identify? Did a predictive model give them a high probability of being Black? Are they labeled as Black in an administrative database? There are so many different ways that people get tagged with various social identities that it's critical that we explicitly, transparently say how they came to be in that box. That's still not enough. That's not the stopping place, though, because we need to know how they came to be in that box from what choices. So we really like more and more in the science world to use that word self-identified. that a person self-identified as Black, self-identified as LGBTQ. We really like that word self-identified because it makes us feel like this person was empowered. However, how empowered this person was is very dependent on what their choices were. This is from an actual project that I was doing with a big tech company that was able to collect tons and tons of data and test out different things. And the way that the boxes were presented to the person changed how that person identified. And so we absolutely need to know what was selected. We need to know who made the selection, and we need to know what categories were available if we're going to even begin to make any sense of social identity data. Because if we don't, then we're leaving the door wide open to assumptions and stereotypes about how that person came to be labeled with that social identity. And that relates to the most important question about social identity data or demographic data, and that is who defined the categories. Absolutely, hands down, the position of power in social identity data is not the person answering the question, it is the person who defines the categories. And so we really need to know when we are making decisions based on social identity data, when we are including that data in our evidence, we really need to know who defines these categories. In addition to what categories were there, who made the selection, and what was selected. And oftentimes we stop at that first box. We just say what was selected, which is not nearly enough for you to know, for you to make an informed decision about whether the worldviews that have been embedded in that social identity data are worldviews that you want to amplify, that you want to align with and use in your research. So that's just the beginning, the basic 4 things that you need to know if you're going to use or report or collect or make decisions using demographic data or social identity data. Second thing I'm going to talk about in the data collection section is proxy variables. I'm just going to touch on this because proxy variables is a huge topic. But in terms of equity, proxy variables are something that get forgotten a lot. And often we want to use equity, we want to embed equity in the research we're doing. So we start to use proxy variables without realizing that we're using proxy variables. And it's critical in the evidence generation process and the communication of that evidence that we identify which variables are direct and which variables are proxies. A great example of this is New York City Children's Aid wants to understand the relationship between experiences of racism and readiness for kindergarten. So they use the data they have, which is a race identifier for a child, and they end up saying something like a Black child living in New York City has a 65% chance of being ready for kindergarten, whereas a white child living in New York City has an 85% chance of being ready for kindergarten. And what they are actually using by using a race identifier in this case is a proxy for what they want to understand. What they want to understand is what is the relationship between experiencing racism and being ready for kindergarten. But they used a proxy, and they used a proxy for experiencing racism, and that proxy is race. Now, in some cases, that's a good proxy that you want to use. And in a lot of cases, that's a terrible proxy that is going to do nothing but replicate racism. Like if you're trying to understand the effects of racism and the first thing that you do is say, if you're Black, please raise your hand so I can make a bunch of assumptions about your lived experience. That is problematic. That might be well-intentioned, but it is not good practice. So it is critical that you spend some time thinking about, is the social identity data that you want to use a proxy for what you're trying to measure? And it's not just a race issue. There are, this is of course really common in medical research around sexuality. And there's a big difference between a social identity of a sexual orientation and behavior, sexual behavior, and they are not the same thing. One is almost always a proxy for the other. And it's really important, not only that you as a researcher are very clear about the difference between a direct variable and a proxy variable, but that you also communicate it. You can see the difference in what's going to be the front page of a report that says Black kids are much less likely to be ready for kindergarten in New York City than white kids, is very different than kids who are experiencing racism are much less likely to be ready for kindergarten in New York City. Very different worldviews being embedded there, very different choices being made in both the generation of that research and the communication. Last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of data collection is small sample sizes. And small sample sizes are something that comes up in my world every day about what to do about small sample sizes. One example is we're working with a big food security operation in the United States, and they're doing customer service surveys to see, the new stuff that they're doing in the pandemic. Does it work? Is it serving people equally? They have a huge amount of responses to their survey from people who self-identified as white, a small response from people who self-identify as Black, and a tiny response from people who have self-identified as American Indian. Now, the habit of this organization is to report the results and say, 85% of the white clients say that they're happy with our news services. 65% of the Black clients say they're happy with our news services, and the American Indian results are not statistically significant. That is not a good choice for two reasons. First of all, there is no mathematical or statistical test for the statistical significance of a sample size. So that is not a technically correct statement. But second, and more importantly, that is a dehumanizing way to report data, and it doesn't put the onus for that result where it is. When we say we're going to suppress these results because they're not statistically significant or the sample size is too small, we are essentially saying, well, we put out the boxes and you folks didn't get enough people in your boxes, so we can't make meaning for you. We have to own that as a research community, that our results contain uncertainty because the sample sizes are small. The sample sizes are small because, not because that community couldn't get enough people in their boxes, but because we designed a project that was going to have a lot of uncertainty for certain groups, more uncertainty for certain groups than others. And this is a really, really critical piece of addressing data equity from a historical lens. And I highly recommend you follow all of the work of Abigail Echohawk Pawnee from Seattle. She taught me almost everything I know about dealing with First Nations data from a place of respect. There is a huge difference when you're reporting data by saying we are less certain about the outcome for this group of people because of the way we designed our project, and saying or implying these people don't count. Okay, now I'm getting to the promised analysis section. And excellent. I'm just going to briefly, I could talk about analysis for weeks. I love to talk about data equity analysis, but my main point for this section in the couple of minutes we have left is to emphasize the fact that when we are doing analysis, we are building a model. It might be a descriptive model, it might be a predictive model, it might be a causal model. It might be very simple, it might be incredibly complicated, but somewhere along the lines, we're building a model. And those models are mathematical reflections of conceptual relationships. And it is attentiveness to that, the correspondence between the mental model and the mathematical model, that is the key choice that you get to make as an analyst. And so understanding whose mental model is being centered in the way that you build a mathematical model is the critical choice that you make as an analyst. And The most important part in terms of breaking through the myth of objectivity, it's critical to understand that almost always we can't tell which model to use based on the data or based on the mathematics. We have to decide which model to use based on the mental map of how the world works. Once we decide which mental map we're going to use, then the model can tell us kind of what's happening in that mental map, but the data can't tell us which mental map to use. Let's say that we want to understand the relationship between race, economic status, and an outcome, like healthy BMI, food insecurity, math scores, doesn't really matter. And there are so many different ways that we could build this model. And I'm just going to go through 3 really, really simple ones this morning. That we could build a model that looks something like this, where we'll get an estimate on the outcome of race separated from the effect of the influence of economic status. If we use a model like this, we are centering the worldview that it is possible to separate the effect of economic status and race and remove or control, whatever word you want to use, for the relative effects. And that is a worldview. That is a very important thing to realize. It is not a point of view that everyone shares. We can build a model like this. If you're in a certain discipline, you might call this a mediator model rather than a confounder model. And this is the model that we use if we think race is going to affect the economic status, which is going to affect the outcome. It's a little bit different than the model we just saw before. If we use this model, we're going to get an idea of how race affects the outcome directly and indirectly. The worldview that's being centered in this model is that race and economic status can't be completely separated mathematically, but they can be disentangled enough to understand their relative influences. Last one is, of course, in some disciplines called a moderator model. And that is, we think that the relationship that race has with the outcome is affected by economic status. And the actual details of these models is not the important part. I don't want you to get like lost down a rabbit hole of whether this model is a good model or a bad model. That's not the point. The point is that there are many ways to build a model, and each model is going to reflect or center a different perspective of how the world works and what's even possible. In this one, we'll get to see the effects of race on the outcome at different levels of the economic status of the individuals. This centers the worldview that race and economic status can't really be separated, and that to understand the effects of race on our outcome, we have to view it through the lens of economic status. The important part isn't which of these models is best, because there is not a single answer to that. The model that's best depends on the question that you're trying to answer and the worldview that you're trying to align with for the purposes of this research. The most important part, though, for us as scientists or consumers of science, is that the data cannot tell us, in this case, whether economic status is a confounder, a moderator, or a mediator. The data can't tell us that. That is a conceptual decision that needs to be made transparently and with attentiveness to whose lived experience, whose worldview are we trying to embed in this model. And that's why it's so important to the greatest extent possible, have your whole team kind of thinking about these things and talking transparently about these things. Because when it's time for an analyst to build that model and decide, should it be a moderator, a mediator, or a confounder, if they have no connection to the purpose of the project and the way that data was collected from an equity lens for this project and what methodologies were selected in terms of what methodology is most appropriate for the worldviews that we're trying to center, that analyst will have no hope at building a model that actually aligns with the purposes of your evidence. And that's why we have found over years of testing that it's really important to be able to have a kind of a grounded, concrete system that I've just given you a very quick taste of, that your whole team can use to understand what choices are being made and how, if possible, can you align those choices with the equity goals of the work you're doing. So bottom line, today, if you want to do something today, the number one thing you can do today is realize that you are making subjective human choices in your data work. All of us are. This idea of striving to pretend that none of these choices are happening, or to do incantations around these choices to make them go away. It's just not realistic. These choices are being made. Second, identify as many of these choices as possible in your work. And then once you get used to identifying them, try to learn how to make them to reflect the equity that you are trying to achieve in your particular project. Fourth, of course, I know that this is a big part of the work of this group, expand the group of people who get to make meaningful choices about data. It's very hard to understand places where you are embedding your values if you are the only person that is assessing that or trying to answer that question. And five, talk about them, be transparent. And then six, because equity is not a static state, it's not something you can achieve, it's something that we just keep working on. Try to go back to the beginning, identify more choices, and find new ways to align them with the goals that you're doing. Okay, so that is what I wanted to share with you today. This is where you can get it. WeAllCount.com is kind of the digital home of all things We All Count. There's an international community of people that would be delighted to meet anyone from this group and hear your expertise and the things that you're working on. And thank you for listening to me. And I think I will now turn it over to Azadeh. Oh, no, I will turn it back to Molly.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Please join me with clapping and virtual claps for Heather. That was really fantastic. And you sparked a lot of questions and ideas for me, Heather, so thank you. I know we're going to get to that in the panel discussion. But I would encourage people, if you have questions now, jot them down for yourself, put them in the Q&A. We're really hoping for this to be an engaging panel discussion. But first, I'd like to introduce Professor Azadeh Yadollahi. It's really a pleasure for me to introduce you, and I'm so thrilled that you're joining us today. So Professor Yadollahi holds the Canada Research Chair in Cardiorespiratory Engineering. She is a senior scientist at the University Health Network's Kite Research Institute and associate professor at the University of Toronto's Institute of Biomedical Engineering and an adjunct faculty at the University of Manitoba. So Professor Yadollahi is a strong advocate of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, and chairs UHN researches. That's a hard one to say, sorry about that. Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Committee. Well, that makes a lot of sense since you're going to talk to us about that. Her research aims to improve understanding of the pathophysiology of cardiorespiratory disorders during sleep and to develop novel technologies for improved management of these disorders. She is particularly interested in developing innovative technologies for monitoring physiological signals at home and implementing equitable and accessible technologies for underrepresented individuals and with chronic, cardiorespiratory disorders. And I remember, Azadeh, you giving a seminar at one of our BMU retreats a couple of years ago, and I came knocking on your door just for some practical advice. And so really looking forward to your presentation here today, and thank you for participating.
Thank you so much, Molly, for having me. And you're doing excellent job in saying my last name, which is not an easy last name. I'm so proud of you. And I just wanted to thanks again for having me today. And Heather, I learned a lot from your presentation. It's just outstanding. Thank you so much for that opportunity. So I'm going to share my screen and then have a very short presentation. It's so hard to say anything after Heather's excellent presentation.
So that looks great. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. And what I'm going to talk today is about a journey that I was doing or have been doing in the last year and a half of doing a research partnership with people with lived experience of homelessness. And a lot of the things that I'm going to say is about how much I realized that how much I was wrong in my research, design, and practice. So as a biomedical engineer, when thinking about developing technologies and wearable technologies and trying to make sure that, okay, I'm going to have a really multidisciplinary team of everyone at the table, I think of having researchers, having the physicians, the expert in design, engineers, and users who will be like industry partners at the table, and make sure that, okay, we hear from all of them. Until I realized that I really missing the most important part in this table. And that was in one of the meetings that Dr. Heather Ross had, who is doing an amazing job in health equity, especially in heart failure. And that was a comment from one of the patient partners that said, when diagnosed, I changed from a person to a patient. Then in a trial, I became a subject. My identity was completely stripped away. Can everybody be an agent in this process? And that's when I realized that how wrong it is that we are missing the end users in the whole practice that we're doing, or I'm missing them. And why is that important of missing the end users? Heather gave an excellent overview of how it can go wrong in all different aspects of our research. And I don't go in depth in any of those. But what I would like to do today is just to give a short summary of how I was doing my research wrong in two specific areas. One is the tools that you're collecting the data, or the lens that you're looking at the data, and then the way that you're going to analyze data and get sort of outcome at the end of that. And these experience or these examples are from my research in people with lived experience of homelessness. And the reason that I get into that, why I got interested in this population, but just as a very general overview, this population, as you can imagine, there's very serious health, chronic health conditions in this population because of all the gaps in the care and challenges of the access to the care for this population. Their interaction with the healthcare system is through emergency department or getting hospitalized, which is the latest stage when it's too late to take care of any chronic disorders, unfortunately. And consequently, the mortality rate in this population is significantly higher than the general population. And all of these, as you're aware, were more magnified or even more highlighted and brought to attention during the COVID. The example that I started to think about was about the monitoring of respiration during sleep. And how I got to know about that was through a friend who works for the city of Toronto and told me that she is supposed to go to the shelter and work in a shelter, in a men's shelter in downtown Toronto. And she was horrified. And I said, why? And she said, because part of her job or concern at the shelter is that the people may stop breathing during sleep, or the shelter residents may stop breathing during sleep. And the way that they check that, something special. Thank you very much, Sheila. That's very nice of you. And the way that they assess that at the moment is that the shelter staff go by the bed of the shelter resident and watch them to see if they're breathing or not. And if they can see that, touch their chest to know if they're breathing or not. And I was horrified for the experience of the shelter staff, but also for the shelter resident, and how dehumanizing it is, and then how much that adds to the trauma. If someone comes to my bed in the middle of the night and touch my chest to know if I'm breathing or not, I would either scream or punch them in their face if I'm not doing something else. And then I thought, oh, look, we have all these like wonderful tools to monitor breathing during sleep. Why shouldn't we use one of them in the shelter residence? And then looked more into the breathing problems. That yes, the comorbidities of sleep apnea is quite common in this population. There is no study in the world looking at the prevalence of sleep apnea, just because of the high risk of obesity, smoking, lung disease, and hypertension. We should have a high prevalence of sleep apnea. And how do we do that to assess sleep apnea? The first solution is to do a full sleep study in a lab. That means that the people should come to the lab, stay there overnight with all these 20 sensors connected to them, which is inconvenient. But most importantly, for the shelter residents, it's not feasible. They don't have a family physician to come to the sleep lab. They may feel scared or not trust the lab to come there. Then we searched at the next potential option are portable devices to monitor sleep. And then we try to find the best one that is the most convenient one and gives most accurate data compared to the full polysomnography. And importantly, it has a very nice way of assessing brain signals during sleep to know if someone is asleep or awake, because we thought that these populations are having a lot of sleep fragmentation. And we thought, okay, this is the best that we found. And the next set of the ways to assess sleep and breathing problems are the questionnaires that should be quite easy to do, because this is like one example of the questionnaire, the most widely used in the clinical practice, highly validated in the general population, and the questions are quite benign. So that seems a very reasonable way to know the risk of sleep apnea. So then that's when I really started to look into that, and then said, okay, let's start with this questionnaire. It's just 8 questions, quite simple. Yes, no, shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. And then take this to the shelter. And I shared it with a person who lived in a shelter, and then also with the shelter staff. So what I would like you to do is to look at these 8 questions about snoring, tiredness, and let me know what you think. Is there any problem there? Do you have any concern? So the first response that I got was that it's offensive. We are not going to take this questionnaire to the shelter. And I was shocked. What is offensive here? Why are you so concerned and even scared of taking these to the shelter residents? And the first point was, you're asking for the gender as a man or, the question is men or women. And there is a good proportion of people in the shelter that don't identify themselves as man or woman. And you can't take this because it is offensive, they're gonna get hurt, it adds to the trauma, and then it can really go in the wrong direction. So no way. So we added that question of, instead of asking gender as men or women, to have an option of other. I don't know what to do with the data of the other, because there is nothing in the sleep literature about what to do with that, but we said, okay, we add that question. Then the second feedback was quite amazing, that this questionnaire is meaningless. You're not going to get any relevant data from that. I said, what do you mean? And was like, you're defining being tired as someone falling asleep while driving. Which one of the shelter residents are driving? What does it mean to them? You're asking about the snoring and loudness of the snoring as the bed partner elbow them at night, but they don't have a bed partner. So this doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense to take that. And that was like when I realized how much we could do wrong, or how much I could get the wrong information and actually add potentially to the trauma and to the harm or the inequity just through the tools that we're using to collect the data. And this is just one of the examples. The other one is that again relates to the tool that we are getting the data, but also the way that we're going to then analyze the data and what can go wrong is about assessment of the sleep. And assume that again, we're going to have these two options that we thought of getting the sleep, the breathing data during their sleep at night. So either go for a sleep monitor that does the respiratory monitoring, and then a good way of, as I said, monitoring their brain signals. It's better than in lab, but it is portable, but it is still bulky. Or other options that a lot of you are familiar with, different wearable devices, either the ones that are record, like the one that we developed to record breathing over the neck, or the watches, or all of these combination that they record respiration. They make some guess about if someone is awake or not, but they're not that accurate. And then when I was talking again with the shelter residents, the very first thing that I noticed is that no matter what, my data is going to be quite misleading, or my analysis is going to be misleading, because I assume that everyone is going to sleep from, say, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. or something over the night in that period. While this is not the case in the shelter residents, many of them are sleeping during the day because they have a lot of trauma or fear or anxiety of the challenges of the nighttime sleep. Or they sleep for 2 hours, awake for 2 hours, asleep for 2 hours, awake for 2 hours. So that sleep pattern is completely different from what we define as a sleep. So if you go for a device like this, of a portable device, because of all those interruptions in their sleep pattern, or just doing it during the day, probably part of the device is coming off, most probably the EEG part. And we will have lots of missing data that we don't know what to do, or we try to be smart and use AI or machine learning to make guess based on the data we know from the general population. Or we use devices like this that they don't get data. We assume what we get from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. is the data during your sleep, while, and then the outcome is that there is no breathing problem during your sleep. Not because actually there is no breathing problem, but because they were awake for most of that time. And in both cases, lack of interaction with the end users will lead to misleading information. So what we have done in the past year and a half was to work very closely with a community expert group of people with lived experience of homelessness and sleep apnea. And we meet with them every other week. We discuss every single part of our research, the questionnaires and everything with them. We meet frequently with the shelter staff and managers, and then also care providers to the shelters, to try to make sure that the end users are the key part of our research design and development and implementation. And I should say that it has been the most challenging experience that I had in my career, but also the most rewarding things. So I just want to thank all the people that helped me in the past year, and particularly the community expert group of the 4 people, and Heather Green. That Heather was the first person that showed me how much everything that I was doing or planning was wrong. And unfortunately, we lost her in December because she was in the shelter, and then she passed away in between the 2 wellness check of at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. Again, highlighting how important it is to think about providing access to care to the population that needs the most. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Azadeh. And I guess what I'll do now is ask you to take down your slides, and Heather, I'll ask you to come back online, and we'll have a panel discussion. So first of all, just the reflecting on, Heather, your presentation and Azadeh's, it's almost like you guys rehearsed this, because I saw, Heather giving us examples of, whose point of view do you take? And then you just highlighted that it was missing in your survey. And so you learned how to address that. And then also just in terms of surveys, Heather, you pointed out, like, what choices are you giving people? Because that's going to influence the data you collected. And then Azadeh, you pointed that out right away in your own survey. So that's fantastic to see just the practical application of some of these big concepts that Heather alerted us to. And I have to tell you that even though I just learned them from Heather, when you asked me what's missing, I was like, oh, what is missing? Like I didn't get it right away. So I was actually a little disappointed with myself. But yeah, so as Rosie has said, we have the opportunity to make this a really engaging conversation, and I'm going to get us started, but I really do hope some of you who are listening will engage in that discussion with us, and remember, there's not a stupid question, and it's really just a wonderful opportunity that we should take advantage while we have Heather and Azadeh here. So I guess I wanted to start off with maybe a question, Heather, around the perspective microscope, and thinking about how does that impact our field in regenerative medicine? So I think Azadeh gave a bit of a description of that around the clinical trial, right? Not that you're doing a clinical trial, but the patient population. But I don't know, like, can we bring that down to work that we do in animal models, or work that we do with cells, or work that we do with materials? I mean, I know it's kind of on us to make that connection to our own field, but I'm wondering if you can help us out a little.
Yeah, sure. Before I do, I just really do want to express I've just been so emotionally impacted by what Azadeh has just shared that, I mean, I have already made a note to myself to try and find more time that we can talk offline, because the presentation that Azadeh you just gave was amazing. And thank you so much. I heard you say that was the hardest thing you've done in your work, and that really is the follow-up question that I want to ask that I'll get to when I'm done this question. But thank you so much for that work and that presentation. So the microscope exercise is all about getting out of our habits, getting out of kind of in science, in quantitative evidence generation, we have all been taught that there are certain things that we have to do in order for that to be robust and legitimate. And of course, a great deal of that is correct, like is necessary for rigor and robust, repeatable science. So I'm not just like, those things don't matter. Those things really do matter. But I think our job as scientists right now is to pick up each element of what we've been taught is necessary for rigorous science, and just ask the question again, according to whom? And that is a way I think that the microscope tool could be applied to the work of regenerative medicine, where it is about like a cell or a little part. Before we even get to, this work is going to be about, and of course, I'm not a regenerative subject matter expert, but I have been reading the journals because it's so exciting. And so before we even get to exactly how we're going to design the project, or that this is going to be a next step of this experiment with this type of cell, the first thing that not you, but a person would want to ask is, what are we trying to understand with this research? And that, of course, gets translated into project design. And the translation of that, if you can brainstorm and maybe use that microscope tool to say, this is what we are trying to understand. This is the habitual way that we know to design a project, what questions we would ask, where we're going to look for data, and what kind of knowledge or information we're going to try and extract from that data. This is the way we know how to do it in our habit. Let's put this microscope on the whiteboard or on a Google Doc or on a Miro board, whatever thing you use, and let's get as many different options of other designs that we can use to actually answer this question. Include things that are impossible, include things that are unethical, include things that are way too expensive. Include things like take your Post-it note and walk down to a different department where they haven't been trained to be regenerative researchers and say, if you had to answer this question, how would you? Which doesn't mean you have to do that, but it's how you get different people looking through that top lens and that microscope that will actually give you outside the box answers.
So maybe that's another. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, the last thing I'm going to say is like back to I just like the quote that she opened with about how a person moves from a person to a patient to a subject. You know, take whoever it is that you know is experiencing hopefully what will change based on the outcome of this regenerative medicine process. Ask that person.
Yeah. So what I was just going to say is what I think you're arguing for is having diverse teams, because bringing people together with diverse experiences, well, hopefully, I mean, the reason I argue for that is that you're going to do what you've said, but maybe that's not enough. But with diverse teams, you bring diverse perspectives, and so you can think about projects from different points of view.
Absolutely. I 100% argue for diverse teams. And for me, diverse teams is a minimum condition, but not a sufficient condition. Because, I've gone to countries, in rural Ghana to talk about this, and the people I'm working with have been so deeply indoctrinated into like the incantations that must be done to produce rigorous science, that even though they don't live in North America, they are not white, they are not, they have already been, so diversity is important, critical, absolutely, like that's the minimum standard is a diverse team. But having a diverse team that also has tools that allow for brainstorming is critical.
Okay, fantastic. We have a number of questions, but Azadeh, did you want to add anything at this point?
I just wanted to agree with Heather fully that diversity is important, but that doesn't solve the problem. If you really don't think about, does the method that we do addresses the inequity in our research practice? So there's really that research practice, or even the research question, and then the diversity of our team. And these two need to be together, and having one of them does not solve, because many times we can't have the fully diverse team just because of the limitations that we have. And then the people may not reflect on the challenges of the research question itself or research practice if we don't bring that at the center.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you. There's a couple of questions that build in the chat that I think build on that first question I asked. Louise Moyle, I can ask your question, or you can ask it yourself. Maybe I'm not sure. Maybe I'll just ask this question. The question basically is, can we use these same tools for in vitro experiments? So, that's a little bit of what I was asking, how do we extend these tools to, looking at, in vitro experiments, or just looking at cells growing in the lab versus even in animals or people? So, but you may have answered that already. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Azadeh, you can go first. I don't want to always be going first.
No, I mean, I don't have anything to add to that, to what you already mentioned. And I think that there are ways to incorporate these issues in the way that we are looking at the in vitro data, or even the effects of the environment in the analysis that we are doing. But I leave it to you, Heather.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I've pretty much given the extent of my wisdom around in vitro experiments. I would say that in terms of methodologies and in terms of where those samples came from, those are also critical choices. I didn't touch about, I mean, I could talk about all the tools, but the choice of the relationship between where that material came from and the equity goals of the project is critical in an in vitro setting, as well as the methodologies that are used. And just like every other choice that goes along with centering a set of values, both the physical methodologies that are used to manipulate cells to extract data from cells, and then to analyze that. What counts as the best methodology is a very, very culturally specific question. And so I didn't talk about that because, there's only so much time, but that I would recommend you focusing on those questions. Really, what I would do, if you want to understand how to apply this to your work, if you have a watch or an alarm clock or a computer that you can set an alarm on, set an alarm to go off for random times. And as soon as that alarm goes off, stop what you're doing and ask yourself, what choices am I making right now? Because that is the critical question. In order for you to understand how to align equity goals with the work that you're doing, you need to get a very nuanced, very grounded, not theoretical understanding of the choices that you're making, but like in that moment, what are the observable physical choices that you are making? Document them, and then later ask yourself, what value system is that prioritizing?
Okay, thank you. So we have a lot of questions, so I want everybody to have the opportunity to get them, so, or have them answered. So, which is fantastic. Michael Sefton had a question, and I wanted to go to one just because it's a follow-up on my question. And then Blair, I know you have your hand raised, so we'll go to you next. Michael, did you want to ask this, or maybe I'll just ask it for you? Okay, so maybe I'll just ask it for you. Are there examples where the choice of questions we ask are influenced by bias? Where what we think are important, good questions are influenced by bias? Probably.
I would say there is no way that you are asking a question that is not influenced by bias. That is the bottom line, is that the entire pursuit of objectivity, of unbiasedness, is not a pursuit that's a good use of your time. You cannot ask a question that doesn't have a point of view. It isn't possible. So our job as scientists is to be aware of the point of view, be transparent about the point of view, and do our best to align it with our goals.
Yeah, I think that's really great. It's just sort of acknowledging, the elephant in the room, so to speak. Okay, why don't we go to Blair? and we'll we'll unmute you. I guess Rosie has that power.
I think I am unmuted. Wonderful.
You are unmuted.
So thank you, Heather. That was a great lead up to my question, because what I've realized is all humans have some level of privilege, and all humans have some level of bias. And as a scientist, we try to understand levels to some extent. So you may not, or I may not be able to understand my privilege or bias or level of objectivity. So we need an objective way of determining objectivity. And is there a forum that I can post my theorized best and most objective rational designed experiment or system or trial and actually have it scored by people that may hate me or dislike my design in all kinds of wonderfully lived experience ways where they know that it is horrible. So we can have the presentations that we just saw and actually see the results come back to us and stop making bad choices, because I never thought about the bad choices I was making. Put the choice in the universe's hands.
Yes, love this question very, very much. And thank you. It's really good to meet you, Blair. I'll say a couple things and I'll turn it to Azadeh, because this relates very much to the last thing that Azadeh said, which was, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. And my question is, how can we make it so much harder to do anything else that this is actually the easiest thing you've ever done? The fact that that's the hardest thing she's done is the core problem. It's that it's so easy to not care because we have well-oiled, systems, and it actually should be incredibly hard to not include exactly what you're saying. And two of the things that we're working on to answer your question about the forum is we are working very actively at All Count, because we work with a lot of the big granting agencies and the funding agencies globally, the accreditation agencies. And we think that one of the things that's really missing from, and I do believe in the peer review process. Some people say, oh, you must not believe in peer review. I very much believe in peer review. I am a scientist. But what I think is missing is who we define as peers. And that we absolutely need a peer review process exactly like what you're talking about, where the definition of peer is quite different, and that people who are living in situations that are being impacted every day by whatever it is that a person is researching get to be part of that peer review to help elevate exactly what you're saying. These are all the assumptions that are being embedded in this research design, in this research communication, in this methodology, that the other kind of what we conventionally call peers have been also so indoctrinated into that they're not able to see it. And the kind of the parallel track to that is the institutional review board is very valuable. I'm in favor of institutional review boards, but again, I think they are the bare minimum. We're working with several universities in the States right now to institute community review boards that, for example, the South Side of Chicago is one of the most over-researched places in the world. And they aren't accruing value from all the research that's being conducted on them. Instead, people with, fancy academic degrees are accruing value, salary, tenure, all of this while extracting data. And that they should have to go through a process of review by the people in that community to be able to use data, because that would move us towards Azadeh's thing of it should actually be the easiest thing to do what she did, and it should be so hard to do anything else. Over to you. That was my question for you, Azadeh. How can we make it so much harder to do anything else? Like, it should be impossible to not do what you did.
That's an excellent point. And a lot of that is really, it was so hard for me. The first time is I was not equipped to go into that. I thought that I did everything, but I wasn't ready for the challenges that it has. I thought that I have a social worker, I have all these people there, but the problems of the language, even of how we're talking and seeing the problems. And then when it comes out of them talking all of these problems with my community expert group, and then now I'm going to the granting agencies, and the granting agencies are now looking at me and say, okay, you know, this is a very important problem, but where is your preliminary data? How many people did you do analysis in the shelter to do if they have sleep apnea to diagnose? How many people did you treat to have that preliminary data? And then I can go back to them and say, I have to do a lot of preparation work to even be able to build the trust or know what the magnitude of the problem is to do the analysis. So even getting the understanding that the preliminary data may be very different when you go back to the granting agency, and they appreciate those challenges of even building the trust as part of the structure was quite hard for me, or to try to convince them that it's not that you can just have the same lens of assessing different projects or research projects and preliminary data when you're dealing with a clinical challenge in a community. What does it mean to really engage community in your research? So how should granting agencies fund the research if there is no clear interaction or engagement of the end users or the people with lived experience there? What having physicians is excellent, but I'm pretty sure that we all have the experience that our feeling of our disorders are very different from our physician's care. And how so if you're going to really have to make a change to make the process easier, I think a big part of that is how the research is being assessed, how the granting agency look at the research and fund the research based on whether you do have that community or people with lived experience there or not.
Yeah, well, these are really big questions. There's some really fantastic questions in the Q&A, and I fear that I don't want to rush through the answers to them because they're not easy questions to answer. But I think, Julia Tausch and Lily Takuchi, you guys have both brought up really important questions, really for us to take back and to think about, how do we amplify this message of, in our own communities, of different points of view, and bringing marginalized communities into the questions that we're trying to ask, and then the ways in which we're trying to answer those questions. So those are, and that's really why we had this session, was to, enhance, first of all, just let's start by understanding and getting a basis for knowledge, and then thinking about, okay, now that we have this knowledge, what do we do with it? And so thank you both for asking those really important questions. I know that I had more questions. I know that Heather and Azadeh had more questions too. And there was another question around, how do you determine how much data is enough to make conclusions, which I know that in itself could be so long, but we're coming to the end. So thank you both so much, Heather Krause and Azadeh Yadollahi, for giving us this really both very inspiring talks, inspiring us to think differently. And that's what I love about my job, is this idea of thinking differently and learning every day. And so thank you so much for bringing that to all of us at Medicine by Design and our extended community. And, on behalf of the Healthy and Inclusive Labs, we're so grateful. And